Well, thank you everyone for coming, and also to our hosts for tonight. And we're all very privileged tonight to have Meira, who has had a most fascinating life. So she was born to an Indian father and a Swiss mother, born in London, raised in London, actually went to art school and mastered textile design before moving to Japan in the 1960s, where she penned her first novel in 1979, and after that published another 4 in Japan, another 2 in India, where she lived for 5 years in 1970s, and then when she finally moved to Singapore in 1997, she embarked on an 8-year journey at the prompting of President Nathan. And out of that 8-year journey, she published in 2010 this book called A Different Sky, which chronicles the story of 3 families over the course of 1920s to 1950s. So it's an amazing masterpiece, and so much work has been put into that. And I'm sure that many of you have read this and are totally fascinated by the process. And so, maybe we could I would just start with the question. I'm sure you have tons. But Meira, you have literally, in your own words, lived within the cracks of culture. And all your books that you have written since the very first novel that you penned, all 8 of them, you deal with the topics of, a sense of identity and a sense of belonging. Have you found your sense of identity and belonging?
Well, that's a very pertinent question, but before I answer it in any way, I would just like to say that I'm very overcome to see so many of you here, and thank you really for coming, and many thanks to Vimla for hosting this evening, which is just wonderful in this beautiful, beautiful house, which she tells me this is a christening of this house, and wow. She had hoped to have evenings like this, and this is the first one. So Vimla, thank you so much, and thank you also to the Book Council for asking me to be the inaugural author in this series of Twilight Tales. I'm very privileged and very honored to be here. So thank you, Rama, and thank you, all of you, for coming. So to answer your question, tell me again, what did you want me to answer?
All 8 of your novels that you have penned, all this.
Have I yet found my sense of belonging and identity? Absolutely not. I think I've come to a conclusion at this late stage in my life that I don't belong anywhere. I can't belong anywhere. I belong to myself, and my identity. I've spent my whole life trying to find where I belong, where I fit in, and so at this stage in my life, suddenly it really no longer matters, because I've realized that I just am who I am, and I feel very much more at peace with myself since I have made that decision. A lot of my life was spent feeling that I didn't fit in, that I was different. And as a child, of course, and a child always wants to belong and be the same as everybody else, it was quite a painful sort of position to be in. But at this stage in life, as I've said, I feel I just belong to myself. I am who I am. And the things that before I found very difficult frictions in my life, I now feel are perhaps the greatest richness that I could ever have been given. And I'm very grateful that I don't belong and that I don't have a completely formed identity. So it's, to me, a great richness at this point in my life. And And I have to say that I've been now in Singapore for about 17 years, I think. I came in 97. And I've become Singaporean, very, very happily so. And I must say that I feel very much at home here, because I have never lived in a place where I have met so many ethnically mixed up people as myself. So I have a great sense of relevancy, I feel, here in Singapore. And I'm very, very grateful for that and what Singapore has given me.
That's wonderful. And yes, and Meira has, of course, contributed greatly to our art scene here. She has acted as a mentor at the NUS Creative program, also the RE program that's in our country as well. So thank you very much for your contributions. Does anyone have a question for Meira at this stage?
Could I ask you,
Yes.
You said that you feel that you don't belong to anyone but yourself, and you come from mixed parentage, and you've lived in different countries. Do you think the fact that you do not belong or do not have a definite identity as such, that it has helped you to look at all these different communities from the outside and therefore give you a greater perspective of the people, the culture, which has enabled you to write these different stories based in different countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am a marginal person, and I think it's an established fact that writers are, what can I say, observers rather than active participants a lot of the time. So that position of being marginal suits me very well, and complements the work that I do and allows me to do that. So yes, definitely, absolutely, I feel that. Writers usually, if you look, it's a strange craft and a very strange life that a writer leads in many respects, in that if you look at the life of any writer, usually you will find that at some point, quite early in their lives, things have happened that make them feel somewhat outside society. They may, as a child, have had a long illness and not participated in life, but been on their own a lot. They may have suffered greatly from the death of a parent or the divorce of parents. There are all kinds of things that make a child early in its life feel that they do not belong or are not quite the same as everybody else. And these are the things that stimulate the need to write in a person. Usually writing is begun as a therapeutic act, and then it sort of takes its hold upon you, and then you're drawn into the craft. But usually it does begin for therapeutic reasons, because one doesn't feel quite that one fits. And I think if you look at the life of any writer, you will find that something of that is there.
Right. So you actually went to art school. So many people also use art as a form of therapy. So why did you end up going to Australia to do a PhD in creative writing? Was art not enough for you?
No, I haven't painted for years, but I did go to art school in London, to St Martin's, which is quite a well-known place, and I did textile design, and I do remember that even when I was at art school, my sketchbooks were sketches from the beginning to the middle, but always writing from the end to the middle. So even though I wasn't conscious of of writing as such in capital letters at that age. I always thought that I was going to be a painter or work in art in some way. Obviously something was there and was beginning, and when I think back to my childhood, although I was always drawing, but although I didn't write that much, I would always, from a very, very early age, put myself to sleep by telling myself stories. So the need for escape into fantasy was there from a very early age.
Great.
But I did continue with art. In fact, when I was in Japan in the early years, I taught art for about 10 years at an international school in Kobe, where we lived. But in the 1970s, although my father was Indian, I had no contact whatsoever with India. My father came to England in 1919, which was a very distant age before the waves of Indian immigration began in England. So the England that I was born into was a monocultural type of society, not the multicultural society we all know today. So this was one reason why I felt very different, because I was the only non-English girl in my very elite British school, and there were just no Indians. My father used to tell us how he travelled 10 miles across London to find the only other Indian he knew, and now today that seems almost absurd, but it was another age, it was another England. So he married my mother in London, who was Swiss, also an immigrant. So in our home, the only language, because my mother didn't understand my father's language, my father didn't understand my mother's language, the only language of communication was English. And my mother's influence was very strong in our home. We didn't eat Indian food, we ate sauerkraut and sausages and things like that much more. So I actually knew very, very little of India, and the only sense of India I had was my father's dark skin. And so when I finally, with my husband, went to live in India, because my husband, although Indian, left India at the age of 19 and was setting up a business in Japan, so when we married, that's where I went. So I had no sense of India at all. And in the 1970s, circumstances changed, and we needed to go to India, and we thought we were going forever. And so we packed up in Japan and went to India. Now this was my first contact, really. I'd had a week or two at a time in India, but never lived there. And for me, the revelation, I think, of meeting a half of myself that I had never ever met before, that I had probably suppressed, rejected, but simply never met, I think, was an enormously disturbing, liberating, strange experience. And although I continued painting, there was no way that I could pin down experience, pin down what I was feeling, what I was seeing, what I was processing, what I was analyzing, both about what was around me outwardly and what was going on internally within me. There was no way to do that through the brush. And suddenly words were the only form that my need to express myself could take. So slowly, I'm afraid, painting fell by the wayside, and writing became all important and all consuming to me.
And this happened in Japan. That was where you penned your first novel. Were there particular circumstances under which?
Yes, I wrote a lot in India during the 5-6 years we lived there. I wrote not a novel, I wrote short stories. Short stories are much, not easier, but simply you don't have the weight to sustain and carry that one does with a novel. You dip in, you come out, you dip in, you come out. So it's easier, and always easier usually for a new writer to sustain a short story rather than the weight of a novel, which can take a year, can take 10 years, can take, well, the last winner of the Booker Prize last year was 23 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I wrote a lot of short stories. Some published, some were not published, and then I felt enormous release when I wrote these stories, all about Indian characters. And it's very strange, although I say I knew nothing of India, I had never lived in India, subconsciously there was a connection that allowed me to go into the Indian skin in a way perhaps if I was a total outsider might have been much more difficult. So I wrote all these short stories, and then circumstances changed again, and we realized that we would be going back to Japan, which we'd never thought we would be doing. And I was, although I had gone to India actually very, very reluctantly, more than reluctantly, I'd gone kicking and screaming because I had felt that I was relatively settled in Japan and I didn't want this to face what I was going to face in India. So I was actually very happy finally in India, and I then did not want to return to Japan, but return we had to. And one of the reasons I did not want to return was that I was doing all this writing about India and Indian subjects, and I felt I had found my material forever. And as a very new and young writer, I didn't realize that you need never lose your material. And I felt at that point that leaving India would mean that I lost my material and I would not be able to write. So this was quite a devastating thought for me. But we went back to Japan, and it's quite, living in Japan, at least for me, and in the place I was living in the circumstances I was living in, was not that easy. As I was telling Joanne earlier, it's an incredibly wonderful place to visit, to have a short posting in, but it is not a country generally for a non-Japanese to live long-term in happily. It's a very difficult society to live within long-term, because there is really no point of assimilation. So you live forever on the periphery, and as one grows older, that's a very diminishing situation to live in when you cannot participate fully in the society you are living in. So I went back and was desperately unhappy and stopped writing completely and thought, well, I've lost my material, I will never write again. And I didn't write, and a year went by, and I woke up, I remember still clearly, I woke up one night at about 2 a.m. It's always 2 a.m. these things happen. I woke up at 2 a.m. with words in my head. And I didn't know what was going on. I took no notice. But these words would not go away. And they buzzed in my head for a long time, for a few days. And in the end, just to get rid of the words, I sat down and I wrote them out. And I remember that sentence still. It was, that summer was a first growing up. I wrote that sentence out. And before I'd even finished it, another sentence appeared, and then another. And before I knew it, I had a paragraph, 2, 3 paragraphs. I had a page. And before I knew it, I was writing a novel. And I would go to my small desk every morning and sit down, and it was as if this was automatic writing. I was being dictated to. I just wrote out the words I heard in my head. And finally, after a few months, I got to the end of a sentence and put a full stop, and I knew that was it. My book was written. I have, let me tell you, dear people, never ever had it that easy again. I have had to work for every word. And I was quite surprised myself that there was this whole stack of paper and a novel was written, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. And since I had only published short stories in anthologies or magazines before, I didn't have a publisher behind me, so I thought, now what am I going to do with this thing? Who do I send it to? But I parceled it off, and I sent it to a publisher in London, John Murray. And I sent it to them because they published a writer I admired at that time called Ruth Judvala, who was very popular at that time. I think she's long dead now, and she's probably fallen out of fashion a bit. But I felt if they published her, they were not entirely Eurocentric in what they published material-wise, because her work was all about India. So the novel I had written was not about India, and this, let me tell you, was another thing that surprised me. It was the story of a child in Japan who was half Japanese and half English and is left for a summer. Her mother has a nervous breakdown and goes back to England, and she's left for the summer with her Japanese father, an older brother, and an evil maid. So this is a coming of age story. So I didn't quite know what I had written, but I sent it off to John Murray, and almost by return of post I got a letter from them saying they were delighted to accept this manuscript. Wow. And they told me it was the first piece of fiction they had accepted in the first quarter of the year. Wow. So I was very, very lucky, really, in that way. And eventually it came out, and it was only actually when it did come out, and it was very well reviewed in British newspapers, it was only when I read the reviews that I began to realize what the process of writing involved, and actually what I was doing, what I had done, and because the reviews talked about things like cultural duality, spiritual isolation. Now, as I was writing, these were things that hadn't entered my head at all. And it was only then that I began to realize what the place that creativity comes from. And through that creativity, and it's no different for any other writer, what you are actually exorcising within yourself and your own experiences. So that was the beginning for me for realizing really what a fascinating journey this journey of creativity was. So I've forgotten what the question was.
But also to this creativity, there's also discipline. I read somewhere that you sit at your desk at 10 and you write until 3 or 4. Is discipline required in creativity, or do you think, like, your first novel?
No, that, as I say, I've never had it that easy. And even then, that was. I went to my desk at 10 every morning, and I sat there every day. Writing is a very lonely occupation. You can only do it when you're alone. Mm-hmm. So most writers live solitary lives in four bare walls or book-lined walls. We're not greatly social people. Sorry, say it again.
Whether creativity requires
I often get asked, where does inspiration come from? And I tell people that inspiration only comes when you are working. And it is true. It doesn't, yes, maybe you hear something, you glimpse something that sparks an interest, but real inspiration comes when you are working. And every craft, and don't forget that writing is a craft, every craft demands its discipline. And unless you have that discipline, unless you can exert that discipline, you will not get very far. It demands commitment, it demands sacrifice, it demands everything that you have to give it. So it's not a flighty thing, and anyone who tells me they want to be a writer, I tell them, go away and think about it. You'll be much happier doing other things.
So are there any questions?
Since you've written so many books and stories, do you have any favorite ones, and why?
Not really. It's very strange, but writing a novel is like taking a journey without a map. You don't even, publishers like plans, so it's good to have a plan. But even if you have a plan, you don't actually know where you're going to end up, because writing a novel is a bit, it's like a plane taxiing along a runway. At some point, there has to be liftoff. And that liftoff is when every writer writes from the subconscious. So that point of liftoff is when the subconscious takes over the story that you have consciously put together in a plan. And then very strange things begin to happen. And when you get to the end of a novel, you may find yourself on some far shore that you didn't expect ever to be on. But when you got there and you look back, you realize that from the very beginning, this was actually the point that you were going to So I've got to backtrack again. What was
Which is your favorite?
Your favorite novel?
favorite? So it's a strange process, and although you've done it once, twice, 3, 4 times, every book that one starts is like the first time you're writing, the first book. And every book demands your all, and they're like children, and it's very difficult to say which is your favorite child. Every child will have something that you feel tender about, but it doesn't mean that you prefer one child over the others. Edmund.
Have you started writing the next novel?
I'm hopefully just finishing the next novel. As Joanne said, I rather foolishly did a late-age PhD in creative writing, and my dissertation was about the Indian National Army, which, if any of you know about the war in Japan, this was an army of freedom fighters that was headquartered in Japan, supported by the Japanese, because they thought the army would go into India and liberate India, and they would follow, and there would be, you know, more of a Japanese occupation of India than anything else, I think. But anyway, a very famous freedom fighter called Subhash Chandra Bose was brought to Japan to command this army. Now, what interested me particularly, and what my dissertation was about, was not only the army, but Bose was Bengali, and he grew up in Bengal at a time when there was a great drive for women's emancipation, which was quite, unusual in the India of that time. So when Bose took command of the army, he insisted that there be a regiment of women in this army, Indian women. And a very, very small regiment was formed. I think numbers vary. Some people say 4,000, but I think not more than 1,000 women. But what interested me was there was a very small number of educated women, and these women formed the commander class of the army. But 80% of the women in that regiment were illiterate subaltern women who came from the rubber estates of Malaya, who had been living in situations of complete disempowerment, often abuse, sexual exploitation. And so from those positions they came into this regiment into really relatively full empowerment, because they learned how to handle a gun, they learned guerrilla warfare, they were all ready to lay down their lives and go to the front in Burma. And then after the war, the army was disbanded, and they all went back into their positions of disempowerment. So that arc of disempowerment to empowerment and back to disempowerment interested me very much. So this was my dissertation, and because it was a degree in creative writing, it meant I had to write a novel. So my dissertation was basically a novel and an academic essay examining the novel. So I am now rewriting that for commercial publication, because I've discovered that a novel for academic reasons differs very much from a novel for commercial publication. So hopefully in another few weeks I will be sending that off to the publisher.
You mentioned that you've got to get your subconscious out. How do you kind of get your conscious mind to let go and open up the doors to let the subconscious out? Do you have any?
It's a very, for me, very easy process. It seems to happen completely
Well, that's not fair.
spontaneously. But I am a writer, and that is an ability that I think most writers of fiction do have. Let me perhaps tell you, how can I explain it? There's a very interesting story about Robert Louis Stevenson, who had a terrible dream one night, absolute nightmare, and he woke up and he told his wife about this terrible dream he had. And the following morning he got up, and this dream had disturbed him so much that he felt he had to write it out. He could not be rid of it. And he began to write about this dream. And that dream became one of the greatest books in the world, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And what Stevenson was doing was, he had in that dream met his subconscious, and he was terrified by what he met. And why was he terrified? Because from an early age, as we grow up, we do things that our parents disapprove of. Our teachers say, "Oh, what a naughty boy or girl you are, don't do that." And slowly, as we grow, we take parts of ourselves that society considers not very nice, and we put them into an invisible bag on our back. And this bag, as we grow, gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And up to the age of about 20, we're putting things into this bag. And from the age of 20, we reverse the process and we're trying to take things out. But that bag on your back is your subconscious. And it contains many people, many different types of people that we all are, all the things that are not so good, also some that are good, but it contains a huge amount of different facets of ourself. And the ability that a writer has is to quite spontaneously reach down into that invisible bag and pull up all the different facets of oneself. And that's why it's very easy for a writer to enter other skins, to become a king or a pauper, a devil or a saint. We have all those things in ourselves, and the writer has the ability to reach down and find those different people within him or herself. So the subconscious is essential. It's the most wisest and most valuable thing a writer has. So when I have liftoff with a novel and I know that moment's come, I am in complete awe of my subconscious, and I know it will guide me to the right place in the end.
Was this the same process, like when you wrote A Different Sky? It's a
No,
historical.
yeah.
It's
Let me
historical
explain.
novel.
So, as I've explained, this invisible bag, it contains all our memories. And when I came to write A Different Sky, this was not a book that welled up from within me to be written. I was very wonderfully and politely asked to write it. And I knew that I would be living here forever, and it was something I wanted to do. But I very quickly discovered, and I discovered it also with another large canvas novel I had written, historical novel called A Choice of Evils, about the Japanese occupation of China, that I discovered when I came to start writing A Different Sky, I had no memory. So what was I to write? I had no memory. And so I had to begin the process of research, which not only gave me the facts, historical facts of the era that I wanted to write about, and I knew that I had to write about, if it was to be an all-encompassing type of novel, I had to take the different communities of Singapore. So research took me through all the arc of historical happenings, plus I had to research each community, their cultural differences, and et cetera, et cetera. But what I was doing through this research was I was building an artificial memory, a memory that, like writing that first book of mine, I could reach down and pull up these facts and write. So I did a lot of research. I researched and researched and researched. Then I got to a point that I thought, well, I'm ready to begin. I know all that I need to know to begin this book. So I sat down and I began writing, and I wrote probably nearly 200 pages. And I knew something was desperately wrong with this book. I tried beginning after beginning. I tried beginning with the Chinese community, with the Indian community, with the Eurasian community, the Malay community. Nothing worked. And I knew this book was wooden. It had no life. It was a history book. And I was in absolute despair, and I thought, how am I going to tell Mr. Nathan that I cannot write this book? And he would make periodic inquiries or invite me into the Astana for a cup of tea to ask, how is this book going on? And it just simply wasn't going at all. And so I just, in great depression, put it aside, and I stopped writing. And I thought, at some point, I'll have to say, I cannot write this book. And months went by, and then again at 2 a.m. I woke up with words in my head. And this time I knew this is not something to be ignored. So at 2 a.m. I jumped up and I went to my computer and I started writing these words that were coming at me. And those words were the first chapter of A Different Sky, not the prologue, the first chapter. And from that night, that book then went forward with whatever difficulties there were, but it went forward. And that again was another revelation to me of the creative process and the subconscious, because I realized that when you research for fiction, fiction is about emotion and relationships. Fiction is based in the imagination, which is a mercurial thing. But non-fiction writing, especially historical writing, as I was trying to put together with this part of the book, is based on fact. Fact is heavy, it's inflexible. And what I had done through research was to build a mountain of facts that weighed down my imagination. And what I had needed to do was to free the imagination from beneath those heavy facts. And the words I heard in my head at 2 a.m. was at last, that was my voice, my writer's voice, which I had not been able to find before because it had been buried beneath these facts. And I realized then that between the researching of fact, there has to be a process by which, and it takes time, those facts are digested, assimilated, if you like, regurgitated and thrown over your shoulder, and only then do you have a memory that you can draw on in your own voice. So it was a very strange, long, difficult process. Yes, Edmund.
Are you able to give us a number, a figure, number of copies sold of different sky?
I have no idea. I don't want to know. I never ask. I never
Back
ask.
to your wooden draft, between the wooden draft and the draft that the very first chapter of your digested imagination, so to speak. How much of the two did you manage to merge together? What was the editing process like?
In the end, nothing was wasted because writers are very good at doctoring. So all the wooden bits I could cut up, chop up, and tuck in here, there, and everywhere. And that was all right. It all worked. Everything was used. But there was a kind of, an outer shell that was my own voice and an imaginative sort of casing, which I hadn't been able to do in the early part.
So essentially you wrote from the first chapter and then continued with that, and then you tucked in bits of the wooden draft into it. Is that...
I can't quite remember. Yeah, I mean, cut and paste is... I began writing in days when there were no computers, and it was a literal cut and paste. So there's a lot of cut and pasting going on. Maybe a chapter I had in the beginning might come halfway through the book. It depends, The process of writing... I was trying to explain to a young student I had the other day, falls into two very distinct parts. There is the process of writing, getting the words on the page. And then once you've done that, it's like you have some huge lump of clay before you. And then there begins the process of editing, which is just as important as the writing, because the editing is the shaping, the polishing, the pulling out of bits, the putting back. You're giving shape to a great lump of writing. And unless you can do that, your writing will be very shapeless,
To offer different sky. You had researched the period post-war period, and then it all goes up to 1955. Now, in that process, you had researched, though you not lived here, and identified the subtle differences between the various different communities and how they're living, how they're interacting with each other. Now that you have rooted yourself in Singapore, and then you're experiencing the groups of people, do you see any differences in the interactions?
Well, don't forget, I was dealing with a Singapore that is already dead.
Okay.
That is already fossilized to a good degree. And after independence, everything begins changing. Communities begin changing. I mean, before independence, there was very little intermarriage, and now, which was frowned on. Communities married within their communities, and now look at the change in society. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure all of you also here, if you look back to your grandparents' time, it bears no relation to the Singapore in a way that you're living in today. So I don't, yes, of course, there's great change, but it's not change because I've acquired more knowledge. It's change that time and history has imposed on the communities. Does that answer? Maybe I'm...
Meira, apart from all that intensive research you had to do, writing A Different Sky, and then your next book on the INA, what are the books that you read? I'm just curious, what do you read for leisure, and who are your favorite writers?
I don't have any favorite writers. One writer who, I mean, every law school book I read is my favorite book, you know. One writer though who I deeply admire and has actually had a lot of influence on me in many ways is Patrick White. I don't know if many of you have read Patrick White, but
Australian writer.
Yes. I mean, dead many years now, but he was a Nobel Prize winning writer, but I think even today not acclaimed as he should be acclaimed. But his use of words and language was something that always and still astounds me in its originality and creativity. But
for, to feed your curiosity about things, about life, what are the things you read?
I try and read my contemporaries. I read very eclectically, actually. I don't... it's difficult for me to answer that, Julian. I just, whatever is recommended to me, or some old favourites I go back to. Like I often go back to Patrick White. I always like to have Patrick White beside me when I'm writing. It's a kind of, just to see his books are an inspiration to me.
You mentioned just now during the writing process that you actually got very depressed after the first 200 pages. So did you have faith that you'll one day just be inspired like you were at 2 a.m. in the morning, or how did you get through that period of depression?
I just have faith in myself and in the work, and I know that usually it's always come right. People ask me, do I get writer's block? And I can't honestly say that I've ever had writer's block, and if I do, I just sit through it, and eventually it starts again. But generally, I have faith that the work will come right, and it always does.
We had one question.
I was just wondering, to use your analogy of taxiing and takeoff, is there a point when you start on the trajectory that you have some idea before your subconscious takes over where you're going, which can suddenly, after liftoff, change after liftoff, when your subconscious does take over, there is like a shift in destination. You know, when it takes over completely, then you in a way, because you started perhaps with a certain course in mind in the taxi period, but then after liftoff?
It depends. Usually I will sense that this is deepening, it's broadening, directions are changing, but usually I won't know till I've got to the end where I'm truly going. I just trust. I follow my nose. I follow my intuition, and intuition is the greatest part of writing. And that intuition is the subconscious. It's much wiser than oneself, and you have to trust it.
Okay, one more question from the gentleman at the back.
I mean, what do you hope readers can learn from your books? Do you believe like every book should end with optimism? I mean, I read very dark novels also. So I don't know. I mean, what do you hope readers can take away from your book?
You know, all literature is about the poverty of the human condition. So all I ask is that a writer, a reader, will journey with me through experience and come out the other end feeling slightly changed or expanded, or they'll say at some point, yes, that's so, that really is so. So it's that communication, it's that the reader enters the writer's mind and the writer enters the reader's mind, and it's that human communication that is actually the most precious thing about both writing and reading.
What are factors that triggers or sets off or germinates an idea in your mind for a book or a novel?
It's also a very strange process. I mean, it's where do ideas come from? I honestly don't know. It's like a lot of seeds blowing around in the wind, and then they'll settle and they'll germinate and sprout, and suddenly you've got a field of flowers. Another analogy that's very mundane, but it sounds horrible, but writing a novel is a bit like baking a cake. You have all these strange, diverse, useless-looking ingredients, and you mix them together, and you put them in the fire of the imagination, and they form something totally different than their original essence. So it's a mysterious process, and I cannot explain it. But, you know, writers are not, we're not people that think in abstract, concrete ways. If the way raindrops hit a leaf is far more important than Einstein's theory of relativity. The smile of a mother as she looks at her child. If you walk along a road and you see a lighted window with a family at dinner inside, the expression on a face, a picture on a wall, all these things, totally inconsequential, can stir, can germinate. It's very difficult to say where and break it down and say where it has come from. It's an completely mysterious process. I wish I could explain it better.
But those are all very concrete images that you've given.
Oh.
It's, you know, it's a lighted window, it's a picture on a wall, it's rain hitting a leaf. So it's these very specific,
tangible,
moments, very tangible things that appeal to one or more of your senses.
It's sight, smell, sound, touch. And I write, perhaps because of my background in painting, I'm a very visual writer. When I sit down to write, I see in my head every detail of the location that I'm writing about. I can smell, I can see, I can feel the textures around me.
So the textiles still no.
Yes.
Have you ever had the experience of starting with one viewpoint character, but halfway or midway through the book, decide that she's or he is not going to be the one telling the story? So you restart with another viewpoint character?
No, I quite like multi-viewpoints anyway. So I'm quite good at having a lot of viewpoints and weaving them all together. But I have had characters that I haven't anticipated being part of my novel appearing. I remember when I was writing my second book, which was set in Kobe, and it was a story that happened within the space of a typhoon passing through. I came down to my desk one morning, and to me at least, there was a character called Arthur standing beside my desk demanding a place in my novel. And I hadn't thought of Arthur at all. But this character demanded a place, and he quite took over the story. So in that sense, yes. Yeah.
You spoke about in your childhood the pain of not fitting in. Can you speak about your role in mentoring, and has that helped you with healing?
In what way?
Well, I'm just wondering, do you use that pain from your childhood or not fitting in to go on to encourage young people and younger writers?
Yes, I do a lot of mentoring, and I always am available and ready to help any young writer, because I didn't have any help. I didn't have any mentors, and how much I would have loved to have had someone to go to give advice, to just contact. In fact, it was very late in my life that I even had contact with other writers. I lived many years in great isolation. So I realized the importance of a mentor in a young writer's life, and I am more than happy to fulfill that role.
So are you happy you mentioned that, writers are often isolated and very alone. So are you happy being alone, or is it something that you have gotten used to?
No, I've always been somewhat solitary. So I'm very happy with my own company. In fact, I feel slightly insane if I don't have a certain amount of hours alone every day. So I've just come back from London, where my whole family gathered for Christmas, and it seemed to go on for weeks and weeks. I don't get some space to myself, I'm going to go mad. I'm quite happy being solitary, but it's very nice to also come out and have friends, meet people, do things. But unless one's alone, the work doesn't get done.
It's funny, I was going to ask you, Meira, do you feel the urge to run away from us?
This is very pleasurable.
Right. So I think when former President Nathan had approached you to write the book, he didn't specify the time frame. But you had chosen the 1920s, 1950s because you wanted to mark the transition between nobody's home to a place of belonging. So So given all the social grumbling that we see online now, do you think Singapore has become a place where people feel like they belong?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Singapore now, there is a Singaporean identity. People talk about Singaporean things. It's become a homeland. It's become my homeland anyway. Yeah, it's a very changed place.
You've been here 14 years. What have you seen, or what have you noticed to be the greatest change from your perspective?
17.
Yeah, 17,
Oh, sorry,
yeah,
17
years.
years.
I think one of the greatest changes I've seen in this short while is the encouragement suddenly of culture. Because I think, if I can be, and I'm sure this is not wrong, I mean, 50 years Singapore has been building a nation. And when you're building a nation, you need doctors, architects, engineers. You need those kind of people. You don't need creative people nearly as much. So I think that over these 50 years, the creative communities have not been so greatly encouraged, and the result could be seen quite clearly when I came here, that there wasn't a vibrant cultural life. The Esplanade hadn't yet been built, you know. There was things going on, but it was in a low-key kind of way. So I feel with the building of the Esplanade, which then encouraged outside artists to stop off on their world routes in Singapore, from that moment things seem to have begun to grow and spread. And I feel that there is that kind of growth has been really quite dramatic in these 10 years. I think there's a long way to go, but it's been very, very encouraging to see all that. And it's a very interesting time, changing Singapore. Yes.
You've written now 3 books which must have required a great deal of research. You've described that process, how you do your research, and then how you have to wait for your subconscious to digest it and your voice to appear again. So do you think you will be doing another book like that, or do you think now, are you hoping that it will be something from your memory, as your early works all seem to be very much centered about where and when you were?
Difficult to say what will. I don't think one chooses a book. Books seem to choose the writer. I have something in mind to go on to when I finish the present book, and that will not require research. But perhaps the one after that I will have to research.
Do you enjoy the research process?
No, I'm not I'm like the lady who keeps her accounts in a lot of brown paper envelopes. I'm a terrible researcher, and I have things all jotted down on various bits of papers all over the place, and I can't find them when I want them.
Do you have to have a story you really want to tell then to motivate you to do the research?
You know, you start from one point and then you get drawn in more and more, and it's a journey. It's a journey, and you don't know where the road's taking you, whether it's going to narrow, it's going to broaden, and what the scenery is up ahead. It's all a very strange thing. So I don't quite know what I will go on to and what will happen in the process.
From my understanding, it sounds like you've written mostly from your subconscious and using your intuition, and you might not know how the story's going to end. But for do you have a sort of a basic structure in your head of like, this is how the story is almost going to progress?
Yeah, I mean, what I was explaining was basically the inner process of creative writing. But yes, I have a story planned. Publishers always want to see plans, so I hate writing plans, but I write a plan, so I have that upper conscious level, everything in place. I know what I'm going to be writing about. I know what who my characters are. But once I begin, this this river beneath a river almost, takes over. And that has to happen for a novel to carry conviction, both for the writer and for the reader.
Do you have any other questions?
Do you watch movie for inspiration?
Pardon?
Movies?
Oh, I love movies, yes. I think I would love to have done filmmaking.
Not too late.
Not too late.
No, not too late.
Maybe one last question.
Yeah, okay, maybe one last question. Maybe. Okay, from myself, maybe just to sum it up. So you said that my very first question was, do you have a sense, have you found your sense of identity and belonging? And you said no, and that you're very comfortable because it's you. You're very comfortable in your own skin. So who is Meira Chand?
Once I knew Han Su-yin, who was just as mixed up as me. And she said something wonderful to me, and she said, we are a glorious combustion of disparate parts. And that is, I thought that was a wonderful phrase, and it summed up this essence of multicultural that so many of us are in this room. Both the diversity and the richness. So I'm very, very grateful for that diversity and for that richness and what it's given me and where it's taken me.
Yes. Thank you very much.